Thank you all. I've got a colleague here who is wonderful to see you. Thank you. I want to say that this was the most lovely introduction I think I've ever received, and I'm really grateful, Rob. Thank you. I only heard one or two ums. I don't know about y'all. So I really appreciate you all being here today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Uniting Mississippi, a book that has come out in September 2015. It's a project that I began writing as I got to the University of Mississippi. And a number of problems that I care deeply about struck me profoundly. Problems for democracy, problems for education in the state. In addition, we've had a really sad set of moments in the country as well as in Mississippi. In 2012, we had a racially charged murder in Jackson, Mississippi. I'm deeply honored to say that I have the judge who presided over the case coming to visit that very class that Rob was telling you about on the 27th. Judge Carlton Reeves is going to come visit my philosophy of leadership class. He wrote a really amazing speech which he delivered at the sentencing of the murders. And if you haven't read it, I strongly encourage you to do so. But beyond that, we had more recent murders, as you all know, in Charleston. And a couple of states, one of them quite close to Mississippi anyway, took down their Confederate flags once these murders occurred. We've had deeply troubling racial problems in the country, but of course also in Mississippi. And in Mississippi, we have yet to do the same with our state flag. And just this past Friday, the University of Mississippi chapter of the NAACP presented a protest, had a rally to ask the university to take down the state flag because the state flag contains in its canton an emblem of the Confederate battle flag. And at that event, some folks showed up from the League of the South, and several of them wore shirts for the Ku Klux Klan for their group of it. And so just this Friday we had that happen, and tomorrow the Associated Student Body at the University of Mississippi is going to vote on whether to ask the university to take down the state flag, which a number of different cities and towns around Mississippi have done. And several universities have done this too. I bring up these really sad moments and issues because I think they illustrate so perfectly, though tragically, one of the things that's really crucial, not just for Mississippi, but also for the United States, to fight issues of division and polarization, which we all know has increased in the last few decades. When I came to Mississippi, I struggled with the challenge of how to think about progress in a state in which it's been so slow or had such challenges to make it happen. We have a school-to-prison pipeline, says the U.S. Department of Justice. We have had tremendous dropout rate problems. We've had lots of teen pregnancy, hyper-incarceration like so much of the country, and deep poverty. In that sense, when I studied Mississippi, it was clear to me that I was really studying the United States. And there's a beautiful line from William Faulkner in which he says that to understand the world, you got to understand a place like Mississippi, which is why I thought it made a lot of sense to try and understand my country by focusing on the state of Mississippi, as I did. So I'm going to tell you today about some frustrations that I think are in the way of progress in Mississippi. And then I want to give you some thoughts about how to rethink the impediments, how to combat the impediments to progress. And the way forward for me was to think about the nature of leadership, which a lot of folks write about in business books and books on education. Very few philosophers today, and that's my background, I'm a philosopher by training. Very few philosophers are writing on leadership, although I think that's sad, that's tragic. Some great philosophers from all the way back to Plato wrote about leadership extensively, and yet philosophers haven't attended sufficiently to that. Of course, people like Plato are highly undemocratic, and so that makes for a challenge, but we can look to modern democratic thinkers to try and update some of the problems in Plato, to rethink the outmoded ideas and yet learn a lot, nevertheless, from some classic thoughts. Well, the first thing I want to begin with has to do with the frustrations that I think impede progress. Because if you talk to leaders in Mississippi, they'll often tell you what we need is economic development, which, of course, in a state that has a lot of poverty, seems plausible. At the same time, we have had a lot of measures to try and foster economic development in Mississippi. And we've had some of the lowest taxes in the country, and we've had some of the lowest levels of regulation, and yet the belief persists that if you simply keep doing that, we're going to finally get business. Now, this is important because there are reasons to see economic development as something which empowers people, clearly. It isn't the case that we should forget economic development. Benjamin Friedman has a book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, and he talks about what happens when you look at certain kinds of nations when economic growth occurs. People are more empowered, there's more that's democratic when you have that growth, and yet he chooses societies in which there are certain key democratic features already in the get-go in that development. And he doesn't explain well places like South Africa with apartheid or Mississippi. My argument is that we need to look at these beliefs, these two beliefs. The first, that lower taxes and deregulation are the solution to bring business, and that we can get the moral consequences of economic growth if we can just make that happen. We have had that model functioning in Mississippi for generations, and it's failed, and it keeps failing. And so the question is, what is it that's impeding that? There has to be some cause which is preventing both educational success, which I haven't said anything about yet, but that as well as economic development. It seems to me that what we have in Mississippi and in places like South Africa is a need to rethink that notion from Benjamin Friedman. Not to say that it's false in a number of interesting cases, but to say that in a number of places we need to first think about moral growth before we can envision economic growth. And of course, examples of that are when a state like Mississippi has the symbols we have, and we struggle with the question of whether or not we'll take down the Confederate flag, right? We're quite different from Alabama, in which the governor recently made an announcement. The same announcement, he said, we're taking down the Confederate battle flags from our public spaces, and by the way, we're putting in a $600 million Google facility. There's a relationship between these things, whether or not it's denied. So what do we do? How do we think about this? It seems to me that we need to look at the cultural roots which undermine progress both in education as well as in economic development. And we're not without resources. We may be poor in the United States, but we're still in the United States. We still have a lot of wealth, and we can make a lot of investments and support institutions that will achieve moral growth, which will enable, it seems to me, economic growth. So this is one of the fundamental rethinking steps that Mississippi needs to take. And when we don't have to look far, when you can look at Alabama's example, it seems plausible. Of course, we have recalcitrance among our leadership, but we need to call them out and call them to action. The governor in South Carolina made change happen promptly. The governor in Alabama made change happen promptly. The governor of Mississippi could, but has decided not to make that change promptly. So we have the impediments, we have the problems that I've mentioned that for which these beliefs are impediments. What do we do about that? Well, in thinking through these questions, I returned to philosophers and found a dearth of help from at least modern thinkers about the issue of leadership. And at bottom, what Mississippi needs for moral growth is good democratic leadership. I mean small d democratic leadership, in which we're all supposed to believe in equal citizenship. Good democratic leadership, I argue, is rooted in 4 virtues that we can identify in Plato's Republic, but we shouldn't understand them in the ways in which Plato did. He was highly authoritarian, and that doesn't match our present society, but we can adapt these ideas. In particular, the first virtue is wisdom. The second is courage. The third is moderation. And the fourth, justice. So in a prior project, I devised a theory of democratic leadership, which had a long definition and then a short one. The long, wonky one says that good leadership is the application of wisdom and courage with justice and moderation to the guidance of human conduct. Now, of course, that's a long phrase, and so how do you put it succinctly? Well, it seems to me that wisdom, moderation, and justice can be captured with the idea of what it means to be judicious. So I summarize my long definition by calling good leadership judicious yet courageous guidance. What does that mean? Well, these ideas are abstract until you apply them, obviously, and therefore that's what I do in Uniting Mississippi. I look at each of the virtues of good leadership and ask, well, what can we do? What does that virtue tell us about the state of Mississippi? Among impediments to progress are teen pregnancy. If young women are impregnated, it's far harder when they're young teens to complete school. And then it's far harder for our young people to have parents who've completed college. And yet we have a policy in Mississippi which did not pick what is the most insightful science about how to educate people about sex education, how to educate people to avoid teen pregnancy. Our policy in the state of Mississippi says that a new policy finally demands that each school district have a curriculum chosen for sex education. They have the option of either choosing abstinence only or abstinence plus. Abstinence plus is more comprehensive. It is not comprehensive sex education, but it is more comprehensive. And we have very good science to say that abstinence-only education has a positive impact in a narrow moment, but very little in general. And comprehensive sex education is vastly more effective. At the same time, school districts need to pick one of these two approaches. In a district in which the school chose abstinence plus, the more comprehensive policy, parents who have children in the district and don't want their children educated in that way can opt out. But in the school districts in which abstinence only is chosen, the parents who have children and want them to have that education can't get it. Right? It seems to me we could have had the reverse policy of having the abstinence plus, the more comprehensive policy chosen for all, and then you can opt out if you wish. That would have been a straightforward way to make sure everybody had possibly at least access to more comprehensive sex education without forcing it on anyone in particular. We could have based our policy on greater wisdom, which is available and indisputable, but we didn't do that. A second example of the application of wisdom that could be of great help, I believe, is to look at the results we know there are from using corporal punishment in public schools. 19 states in the United States still extensively make use of corporal punishment. In a county about 20 minutes from my house, corporal punishment in a public school system, or the district, was used 2,572 times in a 180-day school year. This was between 2009 and 2010, that school year. If you break that down to school days and then hours in a day, that means every 20 minutes a child was struck in that school district, and it was recorded that happened. The kind of culture you have in that environment is not one that encourages young people to ask questions of their teachers, to feel as though they're welcome in the school, or to feel safe. When you can get out, wouldn't you want to? Whether or not that's with graduation. The ending of corporal punishment, I think, is a very simple possible policy improvement that would render education more democratic, schools more welcoming, kids safer, and the big picture I'm calling for is our culture more just in our public schools. The second virtue I mentioned was courage. Well, courage in the modern era, at least in policy it seems to me, means trying things when people are hotly opposed to trying things. There's a lot of ways to exhibit courage, but the big picture, I think, is to think experimentally when it comes to policy. So if things are failing over and over in our schools and we don't try new things, well, making mechanisms whereby we can try new policies. Well, in Arkansas, I passed on the way here, Helena, West Helena, and there's a KIPP school there that many of you may already know plenty about. I keep reading each year about how every senior has gotten into college with support. They're doing something remarkable there. Now, folks on one side of the political aisle will insist, see, therefore we need privatization, forgetting, of course, that charter schools are public schools. And others will say, well, we shouldn't have charter schools be the mechanism. It has a certain kind of problem for standard public schools. I'm not trying to say that charters are the answer, although there are a few remarkable examples. There's also some very ineffective charter schools. We need to remember that. So it isn't the fact that it's a charter, but what they're doing and how they're doing it. And so it seems to me, whether or not we involve charter schools, we can look at ways to experiment with policy. I think the grant initiatives from the federal government are examples of incentives to try certain new things. We can do experiments at the state level as well. We're not doing that. And I think that's one point of need for courage that's very much needed, that is attainable, it seems to me. The third virtue I mentioned was moderation. Moderation is important to Plato because if you don't have sufficient moderation, a unity tears itself apart. He actually called, while Plato thinks that wisdom is the most important virtue in so many senses, that he thinks we need philosopher kings, not very democratic. Nevertheless, he actually says that unity is the most important issue for the good city. He says the greatest evil that can befall a city is that which makes it many instead of one, and the greatest good is that which makes it one rather than many. And so while he prizes wisdom as the most important guide for good action, what it should be striving for is unity. And we have profound immoderation in Mississippi, but as I said, also in the country. At the state level, we have conflicts over wealth and poverty. We have conflicts over race. We have conflicts over state versus federal control. Just all over the place, we have these divisions. We have segregated academies, which take a community that doesn't have that much money in the first place and then puts some of it into private schools that won't support the public and then has impoverished public schools without sufficient support. We're dividing our resources. This is an example of the results of immoderation, not moderating those differences. There is such similarity of religious belief, at least of stated belief, in Mississippi, and yet it remains true that, overwhelmingly anyway, that the most segregated hour in America is on Sunday morning. It seems to me that there's much that can be done that doesn't have to be at the policy level, by nonprofits, by churches and community groups. And I must give credit where credit is due. The groups that are calling Governor Bryant to change the flag and doing so passionately with moderation and unity among people who are issuing that call are church groups in Jackson, Mississippi that have held rally after rally calling the governor to change the flag and having prayer ceremonies outside of the governor's mansion. So it seems to me that moderation is one of the most important features that we can be fighting for, bringing people together, making them one rather than many. And that's why, of course, that's the focus I chose for Uniting Mississippi as a book. Moderation can be achieved in a number of other ways, though. The biggest force, one of the important forces which separates people is not knowing each other, not coming together in those churches perhaps, but not only that. The less you see each other, the less you know what's going on, the less you have community with them. When we have such powerful electronic tools as we have today, it is amazing that we don't have more communication around the state of Mississippi. One of our challenges is that we're so spread out around the state. Jackson is our biggest city, and yet it only has maybe 500,000 people. And there's 3 million in Mississippi, mostly divided up all over the state. I look for consolidations, of course, by DeSoto in certain parts, but there's a lot of people spread out, and they don't really get to know each other. They don't have to, and they've had an unpleasant history. But internet tools can really change things. And you don't have to have some sort of big wired infrastructure so much as towers where people can get cell phone internet. And we can leverage a lot of the tools like that to bring change about. And if you think about how that could help, consider at whom bricks were thrown when the University of Mississippi integrated. It wasn't at James Meredith, although people did, he was shot later one day, and of course people were upset and unhappy with James Meredith integrating the university. But at the same time, reporters were struck, right? Why were reporters struck? Because they were bringing attention. They were showing the world what things are like over here, seeing how other people are living, and the result of that, of course, when pictures of peaceful people marching with attack dogs from the government threatening back when, was embarrassing and should be. The more we can have open communication, the more people will realize, oh my goodness, of course, these things that used to happen here all the time are now ending up in the newspaper in London. This happened in the Crystal Springs Church of Mississippi. There was a couple that had joined the church and had been in it for the better part of a year, decided that they wanted to marry there. This was the first African-American couple that had become part of this church in Crystal Springs. And the wedding invitations were out, folks were coming, and the pastor was told, if you marry these people here, we'll fire you. The pastor, of course, spoke with the couple, and the couple said, we love you. We'll do it elsewhere. And they did. Of course, this was in the newspaper in London. We can have communication tools, we can have video, we can have so many more interactions than we used to be able to have, and much more quickly. And we can leverage such tools for creating more community in Mississippi, for making our representatives far more easily reached than otherwise. Another crucial part for moderation is that we need to bring people together, and we presently have, as I said, one of the sad moments, one of the difficult moments in which there's resistance to moderation. In particular, I'm thinking about the Confederate flag, which I've mentioned. It is not a flag which fosters unity. It is reasonable for some people to say, why should I care about the flag? What difference does it make, whether they're white or black? Citizens in Mississippi have said the same to me. Why do we care about the flag? And some folks say, look, if folks aren't going to change their hearts, if they're not going to change their policies, why should I care about the flag even if I think it's awful? Right? And so plenty of people won't vote on the subject because, frankly, they'd rather know honestly how others feel. Right? They'd rather people at least be honest about their division. And so this would be one crucial area in which we can see the overlap of the various virtues. They're not exclusive categories. It would be wiser to exhibit courage, to foster more moderation and unity by changing this flag for the state of Mississippi. The last virtue I mentioned was justice. In the democratic period, we have a profound difference from Plato's day. Plato thought that justice was having each person be in his or her place. And today that language is not the right language. We remember that when a representative from Georgia referred to President Obama as uppity. That's a word referring to someone thinking him or herself above his or her station, right? That idea is not how we should be directing our behavior. That's not how we should be thinking in a democratic society. So the key, I think, for the democratic period is to think about justice in terms of what equal citizenship demands. And I began talking about a number of the problems that I think are evidence of injustice: the hyper-incarceration, the continued activities of the Klan on campus at the University of Mississippi, demonstrating who really cares most about keeping that flag. Just yesterday, or was it this morning, I learned of a representative from Mississippi who opposes Initiative 42. Initiative 42 is a proposed amendment to the state of Mississippi's Constitution, which would demand that the state fund adequately our public schools, according, it doesn't say so explicitly, but in the proposal, according, for instance, to the MAEP, the Mississippi Adequate Education Plan. And folks in opposition are opposed because this measure would allow citizens of the state of Mississippi to sue, to go to the courts, if the legislature is not sufficiently funding the public schools. Other states around the country have as part of their constitution the fact that kids have a right to a quality education. Mississippi presently has a constitution which leaves the matter of the quality essentially up to what the state legislature thinks is adequate. And there's an alternative measure I don't need to get into, which is essentially confusing the voters, and it may have been arguably a measure simply for that, to that end, so that the initiative not succeed. Well, when opposing views are expressed about Initiative 42, a lot of people have referred to the problem of having a Hinds County judge decide the matter of public school funding. Hinds County has 4 judges that are relevant as far as I can tell, and 2 are white and 2 are black. At the same time, Hinds County has an awful lot of African-American citizens, and it seemed like coded language when people were referring to a Hinds County judge as being the deciding factor. And then finally, a representative either yesterday or recently explained that there will be a black judge deciding where your money goes in education. We have a profound problem, whether it be at the funding level for our public schools, which are inadequately funded, clearly, or whether we're dealing with the profound violence like the slaughter we had in 2012. Plato, as authoritarian as he was, nevertheless believed that all people can learn. And if that's the case, our public schools are not reflecting that. We're not supporting them to the extent in Mississippi that we should be. And we're not reflecting belief in the idea that all people can, because if folks aren't outraged at the flaws we have in one district, in 2007, there were a number of different examples. This was the worst, but I'll reference some other cases. In one district in 2007, it was reported that 29% of students had been retained from their freshman to their senior year. So 70% had not been there as seniors who began as freshmen, and it's not because they moved. Okay? This is the dropout factory phenomenon in which so many schools in Mississippi have had those retention rates in the 40s, 50%. If folks aren't outraged, you have to believe that those kids can't learn. A, that's wrong. And at B, at worst, it's just flat-out racism of the deepest and most troubling kind. And when we see it expressed and we recognize it for that, I think a lot of folks don't want to be that kind of racist. I think there are a lot of people who want progress, haven't thought about certain questions, and when you ask them, and when they see the Klan come to campus, they say, "Oh Lord, that's not us." Right? I have seen that kind of thing happen at the university, where our students have challenged things that are problematic, and a number of other students say, "Well, I don't see why it's a big deal, this or that cultural issue," and so forth. Eventually, things come to a head, and then the Klan comes to protest, and the students say, I get it, and then they stand with you to oppose that problem. My gravest hope is that we don't have to have some kind of horrible tragedy further in Mississippi be the motivation for change. It seems to me that we can have the courage, and we may have some referendum vote, which is deeply sad to me that we need that we don't have a governor who will step up and make the change that we need. But all students can learn. We shouldn't have the racial violence we have. It's time to demand those changes. It's time to address the problems of the segregated academies in Mississippi and realize that we're dividing our resources and making ourselves worse off. So those are the 4 virtues, and there's lots more that can be said, and I say some more in the book. But I believe that if we took these 4 virtues, wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, seriously, for the democratic era, you can think of them like Plato did in an outdated way, but that isn't how we ought to, of course. But we can also think about how wisdom isn't something problematic for democracy. In fact, democracy makes us wiser from hearing more voices, from having more people critique an idea, right? Courage didn't really change much, because what Plato thought about courage, I think, is still very much what we think in many ways. Moderation is also important, although someone like Plato thought you could be really heavy-handed and undemocratic in its achievement. And in this country, we need to focus on the common good and allow some folks their opportunity to come and protest on campuses. I think that the argument about free speech is right when we say, among other arguments, that speech is like the whistle on a tea kettle. If you were to stop it up, you'd have a bomb. When people don't have recourse to speak, what else can they do but act violently? Given that, I, of course, would support the freedom of speech of folks like those who came on Friday. And I actually would say, furthermore, that they really helped demonstrate a point. Students can see, and my fellow citizens all over Mississippi can see what's at stake and who values the outdated symbols that are a problem. So I mentioned a couple of policy ideas and areas in which change can happen. I have a number of others that I focus on in the book. As I said, increased communications can be a solution. We have to make sure there's good internet access available throughout Mississippi, and that isn't nearly as hard as it once was, right? I haven't mentioned this now, but in the book I also talk about service scholarships. People really attend to and bemoan the brain drain. Well, young people need opportunities. Unless you give them opportunities to lead, they're going to go where opportunities are. And we can support needs we have in Mississippi by supporting our students, who then serve. I think democratic values in education are crucial. The ending of corporal punishment in our public schools, I think, is a very simple solution that would vastly change the character and culture of our public schools. But just not having it anymore isn't the solution exactly either, because if you call the cops when a young man's pants are low, you're contributing to the school-to-prison pipeline. You're not striking them violently, but this is doing a kind of violence, it seems to me, to our young people. We need good forms of discipline, and there are such available. It's not hard to find. And in the big picture, all of this points to what I'm working on next, which is I'm working on a book called The Culture of Justice. People bemoan criticisms that have to do with what they call political correctness. I don't see why this or that matters. Well, our culture matters. Our culture is the language we use, the symbols we use with that language, the beliefs we hold, the institutions we run, our practices, of course, and the transmission of those to the next generation. Of course, those are invaluable. That's why we're all sitting here in an educational institution. Right? Education is crucial because it's the intelligent shaping of culture. So, big picture, all of this is leading to me to think of the dire need for envisioning and pursuing a culture of justice in the many ways in which that instantiates. So, in all I've said, there's a lot to be worried about or sad about, frustrated about, to despair about, and yet I believe there's a lot of reason for hope. One example is the example from other states. When South Carolina and Alabama took down their Confederate battle flag like that, it seems to me that change can happen. When folks saw changes in the Arab Spring, I think that people could see how quickly certain changes happen. Examples give us reason to believe that progress is possible. Number two, social media are tools that we've never had before that are more powerful for communication than anything we've seen. And we can show a photograph or a video. In fact, the poor man who was murdered in, was it North Carolina or South Carolina, videoed by running away from a police officer. South Carolina, thank you. I'm proud to say a friend of mine from high school was the person who was an advocate for the family in the case that recently won. While that is horrible and a tremendous injustice, we have tools today that can capture that sort of behavior, that can show what's going on, that can spread the word quickly. Those tools can also bring us together in many other positive senses. They can also be sources that we need to monitor and address when there's bullying or these various kinds of, I'm with you on the reasons to be careful about social media, but it seems to me they're one of the new tools that can enable far greater democratic community. Beyond that, while some folks think that pushing for change to the flag, for instance, is a political matter, the college Democrats are fighting for that at the University of Mississippi, and the University of Mississippi chapter of the NAACP was with them on that. And so students at the University of Mississippi think, well, the flag issue is a political issue. Ignorant, of course, of the fact that Senator Cochran, Republican senator, Senator Wicker, Republican senator, and Speaker of the House, Gunn, a very conservative Republican, have all said the Mississippi flag needs to change. This is not something unique to one party. It's the right thing to do. So that's my further cause for hope, is that we have some examples like Gunn, Wicker, and Cochran. Beyond that, we have the tragic and yet useful forces like the Klan coming to protest to illustrate to our students and others why this needs to happen. As sad as some of those folks may make me feel, for instance, they had young children there, including a stroller and someone who looked like he was probably 6 years old. I sympathized for the little man. But these examples and these demonstrations very quickly show what's at stake and make for a clear cause for transition, for change. The last thing to add, and perhaps the most important and inspiring to me, the reason to think that there's cause for optimism, is the tremendous young people I have known and worked with and watched. They have been enormously courageous, including those who led the demonstration last Friday, right? The members of the NAACP and the college Democrats. Though I'm very proud, of course, obviously, of college Republicans, a number of them, though they have yet to speak up on this particular issue. I'm impressed with our students and the courage that they have, the willingness they have to say that that's not us anymore, we want something new, and to have the courage and will to push for that. I think young people are our greatest reason for cause, our greatest cause for hope, and they're getting older and joining in positions of leadership that are important and making a difference. Rob Pillow is an example of one of those people coming up. So all these things together, while we have tremendous moments of political polarization, we have Klan protests, we have troublingly racist responses to initiatives to improve education in Mississippi. We also have a lot of young people who are energetic and speaking up. We have moments in which big changes are happening in neighboring states, and this is why I think there's a lot of reason to believe in the potential for unity in a place like Mississippi. Thank you.
Well, I've had the pleasure of being in your class at Ole Miss, but I've never heard that lecture. I can see why Rob would rate you as his favorite professor. That was fascinating. Okay, by the way, when you were talking about Mississippi, I was just sitting there, and every time you said Mississippi, I just filled in the blank Arkansas, because so much of that could have applied here too. So you probably, that book has impact all over states like ours. So now, any questions for Eric? Yes, ma'am, and we'll get the microphone to you.
I was interested in what you were saying about Alabama and the flag. I have lived in Alabama, so I try to keep up with what's going on there. And it's been my sense these past several months that Governor Bentley's been very resistant to making that change. So if you know, can you describe the process that went on to get him to change his mind? Or is my supposition wrong that he was resistant initially?
Excellent question. Thank you for that. What is it people say that you can know what people do, not necessarily what's in their hearts, right? In the announcement that the flag was coming down and that the Google facility was being built, there was a denial of any connection. This is conjecture, but it sounds about as believable to me as the notion that I'm not a crook. I don't believe that. I think that Google said, I think Google has an opinion on the matter. Look, I have no special insight into Google. I have no special insight into that governor. However, people understand that economic development is one of the reasons why we need progress. And that, I think, illustrates the point I was trying to make, that we need moral change before we can achieve that economic change. And I think that Mississippi is suffering tremendously because of its recalcitrance. Atlanta, many years ago, made an effort because Mr. Woodruff of Coca-Cola invested in having Atlanta have, first of all, its first black mayor. I went to school with his daughter. And we became a city, I wouldn't say Atlanta's yet a just city, but there's an awful lot that has made progress in Atlanta that has yet to happen in Jackson, Mississippi. And Atlanta not only had Coca-Cola, but then Home Depot and AT&T and so forth. And why? Why didn't Birmingham do that earlier? Why didn't Jackson do that ever?
Or Little Rock. Yes, question.
When I was in college 100 years ago, I studied economics in the School of Business. And it wasn't until after I had graduated and gone to school in England, they teach politics, philosophy, and economics together because they're so intertwined in the history and the processes of every country. Are we going to get any closer to understanding that those are integrated in our society?
That's a wonderful question. After the economic downturn, graduate students in schools of business at some institutions criticized their institutions for lacking training in ethics. Now, I would say that that's sort of a minimum standard, is that there be more robust ethics taught in business schools. We should have more of what you're talking about. But there were students who couldn't believe that folks in business had undermined the economy. This was the line from Alan Greenspan. He says, I did not believe, and this is a paraphrase, I did not believe that these institutions would undermine their own self-interest. He said he saw a flaw in his ideology. I agree. Now, it's very often that people have at least heard of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. While they believe they're preaching its insights, they forget that Adam Smith was a moral philosopher who wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And the idea was that economies are supposed to make us all better off. And I believe that has very much been forgotten.
Question. Yes, right here.
You touched on a number of subjects, and I'm just curious, what have you thought about gun violence in the terms that you've been talking about today on other issues? And if so, how do you fall on that one?
Gun violence is profoundly troubling to me. I have 2 children. One is 8 and one is 1.5. And when I think about Newton, Connecticut, it makes me feel a bit ill that a whole lot of young people in a public school were slaughtered. One of the first things that I think Plato would say, before we even get to the meat of what to do, is that something incredible happened a number of years ago. Our political representatives decided to prevent research on gun violence. That's unspeakable to me. That's a mistake of incredible proportions, because we need smart action. We need to know what to do. And there are lots of different positions. The question is, which is going to be the most effective? And I don't know the answer to what the solution is. Other countries sure have a lot less gun violence. But the first thing we need to do, it seems to me, is to instate federal funding for research on gun violence, because the gun manufacturers don't have an interest in doing that research. Right? No, the private industry doesn't have an interest in doing that research. That's where, when you talk to Republicans about this subject, if you're a Democrat, I think this is the way to see it. Representative Nunnally had said years ago, when I met him before he passed, he said that, if it's in the phone book, you don't need government to do it. Now, I think that's perhaps oversimplified. However, this is an example of a need that the private industry doesn't fill. We need the best research to tell us what are the smartest ways to combat gun violence, and then we need to follow that advice. And so the first thing I would say is we should instate that kind of support.
Okay. Yes, sir. You had one, then I'll get to you, Hillary. Yes, sir. Wait a second. Here comes the microphones coming at you.
I don't know if I can ask it the right way, but I'm interested in your presentation in the light of something that comes in. What I'm asking about is gambling. The casinos came in, the Delta towns were able to put in infrastructure, sewer systems, things they hadn't had before. They didn't have to invest in education. They didn't do it. The gambling went down. Does that become and I think the Choctaw Reservation down in Philadelphia has casinos, although that's outside the state tax base. It brings in dollars in the area. Does that distract from what you're talking about, or is the engine that drives that sort of amoral and outside of it?
Good question. So I am not versed in the research on understanding gambling, although I understand that there are many people who have a problem with gambling. And so the question is, are we protecting those people as best we can? I'm pretty sure the answer is no on that. On the other hand, if I buy a lottery ticket and that goes to support education, I love that. However, what effect are we having on which people, right? And so again, I'm going to need to myself learn more about gambling studies. But in Georgia, where there's the Hope Scholarship, which I believe that's supported by, I'm not entirely sure where that support comes from, but I think it comes from some lottery money. What I had heard about the criticism was that the support was going pretty much to folks who were already sending their kids to college. Now, there's different views on that subject, but the bigger issue to me is about where you're getting the money and what effect are you having on those folks, first and foremost. I think once you have money, you can do good things with it, depending on how you do it. But I don't know enough to speak wisely about gambling.
Hi, my name is Hillary, and I work here at the Clinton School. Thank you so much for being here. This is great. Love philosophy. I want to just ask you to delve a little bit deeper into the corporate influence and potential for change. As you probably agree, capitalism has its strengths, but also is some of the reason for disparities in our country. Yet we see more and more how corporations are listening to their constituents a little bit more than politicians are, and moving the needle towards more progressive social justice. So while I'm a big advocate in youth and people like Rob Pillow, and the potential for our youth to change things, and you're not young, Rob, you're a young man, so sorry, youth, young people. But what kind of power and potential positive influence do you think that corporations have in changing, and specifically maybe even with, gun violence and things like that? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. Well, it's important to remember that along with, corporations that sell guns, there's also Quaker Oats. Corporations have many kinds, and, a gun I purchase might be used to protect my life. We understand that, folks have needs, those corporations help fill them. A corporation can do right and wonderful things, and it can do clearly wrong. Obviously. The problem we have in the incredible polarization right now seems to me to say that anytime you say something critical about a corporation, folks think you're anti-business, and I think we certainly need to get over that idea. However, in particular, Walmart is a fascinating case because I don't know exactly how much of what they stopped selling, but my understanding is they stopped selling certain Confederate flags. And in addition, they raised their minimum wages, their internal wages, at a certain point, partly due to pressure. And so I think what that shows is that the more the public demands, right, corporations do listen because they want to make more money. And that itself, obviously, is a good thing. So I think corporate influence is such that the fact that they're at the national level helps. Right, so a corporation just based in Mississippi may not be someone demanding that our governor change the flag, but Walmart is a sign that maybe we should make a change because Walmart's a big employer, obviously, in Mississippi, right? And I think it can inspire our public leaders to look to those examples. In fact, I haven't used those examples to make arguments. I write some for the paper. I hadn't thought about making that case to the governor yet, but that's a good argument, I think, to make. All right, I will.
That's right. We can give it. You can cite Hillary. You've just had permission.
Will do.
Well, look, this is a great book about leadership in the South, and this is a great book that I think describes the challenges that we all live with every day. So we're honored to have Dr. Weber at the Clinton School, and I hope you'll come visit with him and read his book. Dr. Eric Weber.
Thank you very much.